So it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Mr. Tim McDonnell, and he is a member of the Speakers Bureau at OSHER at RIT. And for anyone who doesn't know what that organization is, it's a big organization devoted to lifelong learning experiences of all types, and really very, very effective in our community for a lot of people. Tim was just telling me before we started here that it would be, that they now have about 600 members. Tim is also an adjunct faculty at MCC, and I talked with him yesterday, just meeting for the first time, over the phone, that, antiquated device that we call a phone, and which is really good, so satisfying to me to talk on the phone rather than, Zooming or Skyping or whatever. But anyway, I asked him, well, how do you come to this particular interest in the Underground Railroad? And his answer surprised me. He's actually a geographer. And he comes to the question, or approaches the question, about where the Underground Railroad linkages were, who were the conductors, or in what locales did the conductors live, and who were the people involved, from a geographical point of view. I think, if I'm understanding what you said, Tim, it's sort of like, what are the most likely routes that slaves would have taken from the South in trying to gain freedom in the North, and what were the most likely or the most feasible geographic routes that would have been followed. So he'll tell us much more about this today, and I think we're all looking forward to this talk, Tim. Obviously, we've got quite a few people on, and there's a lot of interest in this topic. Everybody in Lima in an old house thinks, well, my house must have been one on the Underground Railroad. Everybody thinks that, and some have better evidence than others, like little secret hideaways and so forth. But anyway, I'm going to go to you, Tim, but first I would ask that everybody, if they're not already muted, that they mute themselves. And also, you turn off your video so that at least your faces won't show, and that'll make the thing run more smoothly from a PowerPoint point of view. So with that, I will turn to Tim and ask him to, and one other thing. If you have questions, please go down to the chat thing, which on my screen at least is at the bottom, a little cloud that says chat, and type your question. If you click on that and then type your questions into the chat, then periodically Tim will stop and answer the questions. When it asks who should it go to, just put everyone. So type your questions in there, and then when he gets to it, when an appropriate stopping points, he'll pick up some of those questions. So with that, Tim, I ask you to share your screen, and I'll get off.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I know a lot of you are anxious to get back outside, probably. But I hope I can give you a good presentation today about the Underground Railroad. I should mention before I start that if anybody's interested in becoming a member of OSHER, I'm more than willing to give you some more information if you want to. We are doing a summer session this year. It's going to be starting, I think, the second week in July. And we're about halfway through our spring courses right now. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad. I am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to show you. I'm not sure if this is the right page or not. Wait a minute. Okay. So we're going to talk about what I consider the real Underground Railroad, because there's a lot of myths about it, some of which are partly true. Others are probably greatly exaggerated. So you're looking at right here on the picture on the left is a monument in Lewiston on New York, which is on the Niagara River, and Canada's on the other side. And this is to kind of honor the escaped slaves or freedom seekers on their last leg of the journey in a rowboat across the river. Now this is way below the Niagara Falls itself, so you don't have to worry about being swept over them. The river is fairly placid there. And probably many of you recognize the house on the right in nearby Honeoye. This is the Pitts Mansion. Uh, Helen Pitts was the daughter of the family, and she later on married Frederick Douglass after his first wife died. And this we know for sure was on the Underground Railroad. And I think that's kind of important if we discuss the possibility of the role of Lima as well, considering that you're not that far away. Now, I'm going to take it from a geographic perspective, but by no means am I going to, eliminate the history of it either. So there's some things that we need to know before we get into it. As I said, there's a lot of mythology about the Underground Railroad, just as if there is mythology about slavery. I understand a congressman the other day got up and said that we need to start talking about what was good about slavery. And I would like to emphasize there wasn't anything good about slavery, unless, of course, you happen to be the master. But that's what a lot of people believed, that the enslaved people were part of an extended family on the plantation. Many of them had the last names of their masters, which they may or may not have kept after slavery was abolished. They did have their own traditions and celebrations, many of them coming from Africa itself. This is a ceremony when a couple got married, they jumped over a broomstick. And I guess whoever got over faster was going to be the boss in the family. But despite these moments of joy, it was not a good time. Another one was masters were kind to their slaves. There's probably some truth to that, but they didn't have to be, and in many cases they weren't. We'll talk about what in just a minute. They're better off than people working in the factories in the north. Well, there's no question at that time, the factories in the north, in New England, and throughout New York State and Pennsylvania, et cetera, the workers there were not treated very well. But you have to remember, they were free people, so they could always quit. You can't quit being a slave. The only way you get out of it is you buy yourself out of it or you escape. So this is a lithograph probably done in the late 1800s, well after slavery ended, kind of promoting this mythology of this happy family living under slavery, which definitely is not true. One that they would use to justify would be that slaves came from Africa where they were heathens, and when they come to the South, and in some cases the North, they were Christianized, which is true. They formed their own churches, and the churches, the Black churches today, are very, very important in the culture of African American people. Maybe you got to heaven, but your life on earth was anything but being in heaven. So the reality is more like this. If you got married, jump over the broom like I just mentioned, you could consider yourself husband and wife, but you had no legal status. In fact, many times the minister would say, until death do you part or other circumstances separate you, which would have meant somebody was going to be sold to another plantation. So you had no status, and your children belonged to the master. They didn't belong to you. You were expected, of course, to raise them while you were working out on the fields or whatever your job was, but they could be sold to another place. The father or the mother may be sold as well. And in many cases, they never saw each other again. The thing that scared the slaves the most, especially if they lived in the northern part of the South, the upper South, like Maryland, Virginia, or Kentucky, was being sold south where the cotton grew, because they knew then they were going to be very, very difficult, and they probably would be stuck in slavery for the rest of their lives. Masters might be kind, but they had complete power over you and you were considered property, just like a domesticated animal. So they could whip you, they could starve you, they could do all kinds of things to entice you to work harder. And this is a very important statement. This is one of the reasons why they would run away. You had no rights. You were technically a person, but you were really property. So you never got paid. You got food, but it was usually very, very high carb with very little nutrition in it. Your children belonged to the master and their children as well. And he could do with them whatever he wanted. And to keep people in line, they use several strategies. Well, first of all, this is a slave auction, and the families that sitting on the floor there are scared to death that they're going to be separated, depending on who purchases whom, and more likely, the buyer would be interested maybe only in an adult man or maybe an adult woman, because he figured that she would produce more babies, which means that he would have more slaves. The children may or may not go with the family. If you worked slowly, or you were disrespectful to the master or the overseer, the punishments could be very brutal. This is a woman receiving a brand on her back. This man, so many times, his back looks like, like spaghetti. It has so many welts in it. And this man right here, he's got this collar around his neck with bells on the end. So if he tries to run away, they'll be able to hear him, especially the dogs. Imagine trying to sleep in that contraption. No matter how you hold your head down, that thing is going to be poking into your neck. There were other very ingenious and statistics way of punishing slaves that got out of line. Now, slavery begins in colonial times. It doesn't begin with the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the first slaves in the United States arrived in the Jamestown colony in 1619, brought in by a Dutch ship. This is a kind of a painting reenacting that scene. You may have heard about the controversy about the 1619 curriculum. This is what they're referring to, this moment when slaves first arrived. Now, at that time, they were considered indentured servants, which means that you had to work a certain amount of time and then you got your freedom. Many white people came across the Atlantic Ocean in a similar fashion. But Black slaves became so important to the economy that they got rid of that. You did not normally get out of slavery, but your white co-workers could. Now, it wasn't just a Southern problem. It was also found in New York. In fact, New York had the highest number of slaves outside of the South. This is a lithograph showing the master on a manor, probably in the Hudson Valley, with his enslaved man. And this phrase is "work and be happy." And every time I see this thing, all I can think of is Auschwitz, because it's very similar to the one at the gate at Auschwitz as well, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. New York did not get rid of all its slaves. I shouldn't say that. New York did not abolish slavery and officially until 1827. That was 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. New York City had a lot of slaves living there. Of course, New York was much smaller at the time, and there were farms on the edges. About 15 to 20 years ago, they discovered an old cemetery of Black slaves that were buried there in the early 1700s, and they exhumed the bodies and reburied them. And there's a park there in the lower Manhattan, not too far away from the World Trade Center. for all those who were lost, all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, and for all those who were not forgotten. And it's a very nice park, very moving, and a very nice museum there. So slavery existed in other parts of the country as well. However, after the American Revolution and we were independent, slavery was definitely on the decline. And one by one, the northern states got rid of it. Most northern states by the end of the 1700s, and as I just said, New York in 1827. But in the South, it was a different matter because the cotton gin was invented in 1793, and that made it possible to get the seeds out of the cotton very quickly and without much labor. And cotton all of a sudden became an important crop to trade with, especially to England or also the northern states, which were beginning to build textile mills. So the entire Southern economy, especially in the Deep South, becomes completely bound to slavery. And they not only considered it a necessity, they actually considered it to be a benefit for all. Of course, the Black people did not necessarily agree with that. This is a map based on the 1790 census. That was our first census after we became independent. And you can see that the southern states that existed at the time, in many cases, 1/4 to almost 1/2 of their population was enslaved. In the north, much less. But in New York State, for example, it was about, I think about 5% of the population, mostly in the Hudson Valley and in around New York City. But we did have slaves here in Rochester as well, which was just being settled around this time. New England had abolished the slaves, but I think they had a grandfather clause in it. So there were still some slaves in many of the New England states, with the important exception of Vermont, which abolished it completely before they even joined the Union. So we're beginning to see a divide between the North and South here, but it's not complete yet. No slavery was allowed in what would become the Ohio territories, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, etc. By law, they could not have slavery. But if you were south of the Ohio River, which is the northern border of Kentucky, slavery was permitted. And all the slaves, when all the states joined the Union, Tennessee, Alabama, etc., they all had slaves. And as I mentioned, New York had slavery until 1827. Here's two prominent African Americans who spent the first part of her life in slavery. This lady here you might recognize is Sojourner Truth. She was a slave near Kingston, New York, in the Hudson Valley. Many of her children had been sold off before she became free herself. She, of course, was not born with the name Sojourner Truth. She was born as Isabella Bonefree, which was her master's name, but she decided to change the name to Sojourner Truth after she became free. And this man settled in Rochester. His name is Austin Stewart. He owned a store in downtown Rochester on Main Street. Later on, he moved to Canandaigua, and I believe that's where he's buried. He was a slave in New York. He managed to get his own freedom before 1827. He basically said, I'm free, and nobody bothered to try to dissuade him otherwise. Because in this part of the state, there was really very little interest in slavery. Now, that's not because we were nicer than the rest of the country. Most white people considered slaves to be competition. How do you compete with somebody who works for nothing? They wanted free labor only. They didn't like Black people. They meant that they wanted slavery abolished for their own selfish reasons. Now, by 1850, 11 years before the Civil War, This is where the cotton plantations were located, mostly in the deep South, known as the Black Belt. Black because of the color of the soil. And this is, by the way, still where the majority of African American people live. In the Carolinas and Virginia, it was probably more tobacco, however, but both were raised and cared for by slaves. The North had completely given up on slavery, but south of the Mason-Dixon line, the states you see here, it becomes a way of life which they had no intentions of abandoning. Of course, later on, Lincoln referred to this as a house divided. A house divided cannot stand, which turned out to be true because we had a civil war. About 1850, there's a lot more states, including California. The ones in white are all free states. The ones in different shades of purple have large slave populations. In the case of Mississippi and South Carolina, over 50% of the population were enslaved blacks. Now, because the system was intolerable, slaves were always trying to find a way to get out of it. Many resigned themselves to their fate, but especially the younger people, they wanted to take the chance of freedom. So they would find ways to get out of the slave states. They knew that if they went north, they would end up in a world that they call Canaan, like the Bible, but actually they meant Canada, or maybe the free states of the north too. And they wanted to find ways to get there. And this is what the Underground Railroad was all about. At the beginning, it was very disorganized, but later on, it became a system that had all kinds of people working with it in different capacities. One of the symbols of the Underground Railroad was if you had a safe house, or using railroad terminology, you were a station, then you would put a lit lantern in the window at nighttime to let somebody know that if they came to the door and knocked a certain way, they would be let in. That didn't apply all the time, but it was a very common tradition during the system and when it was operating. Now, they did usually try to go to Canada. They didn't necessarily do that, though. There were other alternatives. I'll mention them in just a minute. Now, when you were in the South, you're kind of on your own. You might find a few people willing to help you, like Quakers, but most of the time you were on your own. And therefore, it was very difficult to get out. Once you crossed the Mason-Dixon line, though, you had a chance. There were people to help you. And as the years went on, they were very, very successful. Many more freedom seekers, escaped slaves, managed to make it to their destination than those that were captured and returned back to slavery. At the beginning, it was Quakers and the free blacks, especially in the North, that helped people on their way north. We call them conductors, just like you do on a railroad. This shows a Quaker man leading a black man through I guess a cornfield. They usually would have them go at night for maybe 15 miles or so, maybe 20. And then they would be at a new station, and then the next person would decide what was going to happen next. Then the Quaker himself would return home, hopefully before morning, because that way nobody would realize he was involved in this venture. In New York City, this man right here is named David Ruggles, and he was, I believe he was biracial, but he would consider himself to be black. He helped a lot of people that made it to New York City and helped get them to different parts of the country, or even all the way to Canada. One of the ones he helped was Frederick Douglass. Blacks became Christian and they took it very seriously, but they interpreted the Bible differently than their masters did. When they were read, if they could read, or somebody read it to them, the book of Exodus, they took it to heart, because this is where the children of Israel escape from Egypt. They go across the Red Sea, make it to the other side, and then the walls of water come crashing down on Pharaoh's troops, and they manage to make their escape, eventually making it to the Holy Land itself. They consider this the same thing. When the spiritual swing low, sweet chariot, there's a line that says, I looked over Jordan and what did I see? A band of angels coming for me. They weren't referring to the River Jordan in Israel. They were referring to the Ohio River that separates Ohio from Kentucky. And there were people that would help them get across the river. Of course, the slaves in the American South identified with these slaves in Egypt. Now, there is a big controversy today whether the Hebrew or Jewish people were actually enslaved in Egypt or not. I don't really want to get into this, but there definitely was slavery in Egypt. The Bible itself, both New and Old Testament, are very, very inconsistent on slavery. There are passages that say that you should obey your masters. There's others that talk about freedom and treating people with the golden rule. And our own Liberty Bell itself is a scripture, I think it's from Exodus, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. That was put on by people opposed to slavery called abolitionists, probably in the 1820s. It was not on during the American Revolution, though. So both sides could justify their positions using the Bible. And they tried very hard to convince people one way or the other. To those that hated slavery, it was a moral cause. But in the South, it was an abomination, and they were convinced that all abolitionists were terrorists and they were doomed to a life in the hereafter in hell. Now, it was a moral cause, but we have to remember that the laws were in existence beginning with the Constitution, that you were breaking the law if you helped a slave escape. Most didn't care. They said God's law is more important. So to do that, they had to come up with ways of hiding the escapees. This one is near Niagara Falls in Newfane, New York, where there is a pit underneath the barn, and the owner of the property is totally convinced that enslaved people were hidden there. They probably had one more day to go before they got to Canada. That wasn't necessarily the case all the time. Oftentimes, the slaves were hidden right in the main house. This is a picture showing a slave catcher chasing after a woman. You can see he's carrying with him handcuffs, manacles, and I guess the man in the middle is a lawyer. I don't know if it's Salino or Barnes, but lawyers were involved in these things as well. Many times they were very helpful, though. They could stall the system, and in the meantime, the slave would escape a second time and never be seen again. Now, they believed that the law of God trumped the law of man. And they were willing to pay the consequences if necessary. Although most of them never really got caught, but there were some exceptions. One man in Wilmington, Delaware, by the name of Thomas Garrett, they took away practically all of his property to pay for the fine. And he defied the court and said, I may not have much, but if one of God's poor comes to my doorstep, please, I will let him in despite the consequences. Now, eventually, in some cases, this led to armed resistance. Harriet Tubman is shown right here. We'll talk more about her in a minute. I don't think we have any record of using that rifle, but she carried it with her and was prepared to use it. If any slave catchers caught up, they would not be welcomed. Many later on forcibly freed slaves. There were several rescues where they defied the law in northern cities. One very celebrated one is in Syracuse, known as the Jerry Rescue. There were dangers, mostly for the escaped slaves. The dogs were out. Oftentimes they would trap you, you'd have to fight your way away. You really didn't want to get caught if you could, because your life back on the plantation would be much worse than it was before. You would be punished, you'd probably be whipped, you may have some other disfiguring thing done with you, so you could never really run away again. There weren't many places to hide when you were in the South, so you had to be very self-reliant. That means a lot of slaves did not try it, simply because they just did not have the fortitude to survive it. Most of them came from the upper South. This is a census from which city? This is Niagara Falls, New York. All the names are over here and their ages, sex, M or F for male and female. And the B you see right here means black. And then they have some of their professions. And this is the column that says where they were born. I don't think they ever actually checked a birth certificate, but you notice a lot of them say they were from Maryland, some from New York, some from Pennsylvania, but very few would mention something like South Carolina or Alabama, because it was just too hard to get that far away and make it north. There are some exceptions, but not very many. So you got away. Now what comes next? Well, many didn't try to go too far. They would hide in the swamps. Sometimes they even hid on the master's property. One woman was hid in a loft in the barn in a North Carolina plantation for 15 years. She eventually was, they eventually got her out and sent her north. In fact, she lived a while in Rochester. Her name was Harriet Jacobs. Many of them formed maroon communities in the swamps, especially the Dismal Swamp in North Carolina and Virginia, the Bayou Country in Louisiana, and the Everglades in Florida. Many of them did not come out of hiding until after the Civil War. This shows a community, a sketch made of them living in the middle of a swamp. Often they partnered with the native people, especially the Seminoles. Many of them joined with the Seminoles in Florida. This shows dressed in, traditional Indian garb, but you can tell by their skin color that they're not Native American, but African American. They still exist today. They live both in Florida and in Oklahoma. But what if you went north? Well, oftentimes you took advantage of water. You maybe got in a boat. Sometimes you would swim across it. If it was shallow enough, you'd wade in it because then the dogs couldn't pick up your scent. And if somebody told you the direction the stream was going in, you had your own compass. Of course, they also were able to see the North Star if the weather cooperated. If they had assistance, they were often hid in false bottoms on wagons, often covered with big sacks of flour or maybe potatoes or something like that. And eventually, when it was safe, they were let out, and then they would continue on their way north. Sometimes there were signs that kind of helped them out. This is in Fort Anne. It's near Saratoga Springs in eastern New York. And this man is pointing towards Fort Anne, which is a well-known Underground Railroad site not too far away from the Champlain Valley. Once you got to Lake Champlain, you could get on a boat and the boat would take you all the way to Canada. And there were definitely people that specialized in running safe houses or stations. Thomas Garrett, a white Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware, and his close friend and collaborator, William Still, a free Black man who lived in Philadelphia. They both helped hundreds and hundreds of escaped slaves move north. William Still kept very good records, and we get a lot of information about the railroad from him. We're doing on time here. Okay, now, geography here. After the Civil War, several books were being written about the Underground Railroad. It was safe to do so then because, well, slavery was abolished and you wouldn't be prosecuted for it. William Still, for example, published his book. In the late 1800s, I think it was 1898, I'm not exactly sure of the date, but a professor from Ohio State University in Columbus wrote a book about the Underground Railroad, and he included this map in it. And the routes are in red. Some are by sea, as you can see. And look at all the ones that are in Ohio. Well, this is Seeper, by the way. The number of routes, well, that makes sense because he was in Columbus. So he had a bias towards that particular route. They would make it across the state, coming out of Virginia and Kentucky mainly, and eventually end up in Lake Erie. Maybe they take a boat to Canada, or they go around the lake to Detroit and cross into Canada there. But the routes in the east are very important too, but he doesn't give it a lot of attention. The only route he shows is what I call the thruway route, because it basically follows the same route as the modern day thruway does. I don't know if they had Easy Pass then or not. I'm pretty sure New York would have charged him a toll one way or the other. That's a New York tradition, however. But there are many, many more routes than this. He just didn't research them. But before I get into them, let's talk about the people that were involved in the Underground Railroad. First of all, you had the Quakers, more officially known as the Society of Friends. In fact, that's what they call themselves, Friends. Mostly dressing at the time in traditional garb. Some of them had slaveries in the early days of the country, but by mandate, they were forced to give up all their slaves in about 1785. One of the important leaders of the Quakers at this time was Elias Hicks. Hicksville, Long Island is named after his family. They were very, very powerful influences in helping free people escape. Now, after they freed their own slaves, those slaves set up their own communities, and they also helped their fellow African Americans escaping from the South. Again, they believed that God's law always trumps those of man, and they had no problems in disobeying the law. They did so non-violently, but they were still breaking the law. Very important that women had equal status at the meetings. In most churches, women were not supposed to talk, but that was not the case among the Quakers. And one of their very influential leaders was Lucretia Mott. She is one of the mothers of the women's suffrage movement. She was there in Seneca Falls in 1848. But she was also very, very heavily involved in the anti-slavery movement. If we look at it from a map perspective, this is a map that I got from a website that I modified. This shows 1820s Quaker meeting houses. There are different levels of it. That's not important. But if you have a meeting house, that means there's going to be Quakers living nearby. And oftentimes they would trust only their fellow Quakers. So if you had a slave hiding out in your your meeting here in the Hudson Valley, you would send them upstream to another one closer to Albany. And eventually you would either go west towards Niagara Falls or north into Vermont or into Canada. One of those sites that goes back to that period of time, although it wasn't this building, it was an older building, the Friends Meeting House in Farmington in Pumpkin Hook, which still has an active meeting today. So they would take this route north. Many times they would settle in Vermont. There were a lot of Quakers that lived in Vermont. Or they went up the Mohawk River, and especially after the Erie Canal, they followed that from meeting to meeting all the way to the Canadian border. Among other Christian groups, especially Protestant groups, they were evangelized in the early 1800s, known as the Second Great Awakening. And the great speaker of that period of time is shown here, Charles G. Finney. The Finney School in Penfield is named after him. He was one of the first evangelists, I guess. He preached that slavery was a sin, and if you were a sinner, you needed to repent. They said that he had eyes that burned like coal, and the most horrible sinner, when he caught his gaze, would drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness. Well, his followers became very, very powerful believers in abolitionism. And because they considered it a sin. Now, the churches that belonged to, however, weren't not necessarily so enthusiastic. Like the Methodists and the Baptists and the Lutherans in particular were very divided over the issue. I don't think any of them particularly liked slavery, but they figured it was a Southern problem. It had nothing to do with them. But these people believed it had everything to do with them, and they wanted to get rid of it. If they couldn't convince their own church, then they formed their own. They came out. Now, coming out means something different today. I realize that. But they formed their own churches. They came out of the old church. And one good group example is the Wesleyan Methodists, which had a seminary, as you probably know, right in the middle of Lima. This church, no longer a church, but it's in the middle of Syracuse, near Columbus Square, was a Wesleyan church. And we know for sure they were involved in the Underground Railroad. In fact, they found several clay figurines in the basement there that they're pretty positive were carved by people hiding out, waiting for their turn to make the next leg towards freedom. They are now in the Onondaga Historical Society, and it's definitely worth the trip there. It's a wonderful museum, although I'm sure it's not as good as the one in Lima. Now, as I said, they separated from their own churches and formed their own. And this is a map of the Comouter churches in 1850. There are different denominations, like FB means Free Baptist, U means Unitarian, WM means Wesleyan Methodist, etc. And notice that most of them are in the western half of the state. And the blue line you see right here is the Erie Canal. They were definitely influenced by the Erie Canal because that's when people moved west. They could now sell their farm goods to cities downriver, and they were able to settle now in the western part of the state. And they became evangelical and very fervently anti-slavery. These people, many of which became station masters in many, many towns across central and western New York. And we should never forget about the African-American people. Remember, New York had slaves until 1827, most of whom, once slavery was abolished, chose to live in New York, especially in New York City and in the Hudson Valley, right in here. But many of them also moved west along with other people trying to find a better life. And they settled in the cities of the West, Buffalo, Rochester, and some in small numbers in the smaller villages as well. Good examples. The St. James AME Zion Church, which is in Ithaca, very historic church. I think it's the longest standing church in the state. And many of their members fought in the Civil War in the colored troops. Michigan Street Baptist Church in Buffalo. In Peekskill in the Hudson Valley, there's another Black church in that neighborhood, which still stands today. Favor Street AME, which means African Methodist Episcopal Church, that was in the Cornhill district originally. Now they moved off of Genesee Street, but they were very, very active in the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass was a member of that congregation. And the Zion Church in Binghamton. Binghamton's a very important link on the Underground Railroad because it's so close to the border with Pennsylvania. So you have these three main groups working sometimes together, sometimes independently, but they're all part of the feature here. So you got these things in place. So how do they move from place to place? Well, this map comes much later by A.C. Flick, who wrote A History of the State of New York. And the map, I wish it was a little better quality, but it was the best I could get. And the dotted lines you see here are routes that they are pretty sure existed, like along the Mohawk Valley is one, another one along the Hudson and then in the Champlain, another one towards Oswego and going across the lake in steamships to Kingston, Ontario, and then also through the Finger Lakes, and that may have included Lima. So here's the different routes. This is the throughway route. Harriet Tubman, for example, used this route a lot. The Susquehanna, which is in Pennsylvania, you move north, you got to the Finger Lakes, moved your way across, again, ending up on the border with Canada, probably Niagara Falls or maybe Buffalo. They may have come in from the west, from Ohio. It was too dangerous to cross Lake Erie, so then they sent them into New York along the trails through Dunkirk and Orchard Park, et cetera. And eventually you would cross into Canada on the new suspension bridge there that took you to St. Catharines, Canada, which is where Harriet Tubman lived when she was not helping slaves escape herself. And then, of course, the Hudson, Champlain, follow the river and the canal there, follow the lake or take a boat. And there are other possibilities as well, combinations of these. For example, this is a relief map. You see there's a gap here between the mountains. That's, well, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. You could also take steamships across Lake Ontario. Several places had them. Pulteneyville in Wayne County, Rochester itself did, Oswego did. They went across the lake all the time. Many of the captains were more than happy to help the slaves hide below and on their last leg across the trip to Canada. Or they went through the Black River Valley and ended up in the Thousand Islands. All different possibilities. Whichever one was the safest, whichever one the conductor decided was the best way to go. This is a display in the Rochester Museum showing some of the routes that they have researched quite extensively there. The Tennessee Valley is also very important in this history as well. Okay, now as a geographer, I'm interested in is they got to make sense. Okay, so the path in the middle follows the Erie Canal. That makes geographic sense. You got a pathway to follow. You got places to hide and people to help you along the way. You were not out in the wilderness where you had to fend completely for yourselves. Generally speaking, you want to take routes that are low in elevation, which on this map would mean they're colored green. But you want to avoid the mountains like the Catskills and the Adirondacks, although there are some cases of them escaping across these mountains, but that's not that common. Most of the features in New York work really well to the advantage of people trying to go to Canada because of the Ice Age. The glaciers carved the landscape, and many of the features point north and south. Like right here, these are the two big Finger Lakes, Cayuga and Seneca. Very easy to follow. And once you get to the north end, you're very close to a port on Lake Ontario to take you for freedom. Okay, should stop for just a second. Does anybody has any questions? You want me to wait to the end? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Okay, I'll just continue. I'm almost finished. Got just a few more slides to go. This shows a map of some research I've done of Underground Railroad sites. I'm sure this is not complete, but I divide them into 3 categories. High is in green. Questionable means there's some oral history, but it's not really, it's up in the air. We don't know for sure. Moderate means there's some evidence, but there's nothing that specifically says, yes, we hid slaves here. But judging from the political views of the people living there, they probably were involved, which is why I think it's very likely that the Genesee Wesleyan Seminary in Lima was probably involved in this one way or the other. Here's another map showing the sites. And many of them are run by African Americans. William Wells in Buffalo. David Ruggles, I mentioned him before, in New York City. Stephen Myers and his wife Harriet in Albany. Henry Highland Garnett in Troy. Catherine Harris, one of the few women who is considered the chief station master, although women as a whole did most of the work, but she gets the credit. And she lived in Jamestown. John W. Jones in Elmira. Our own Frederick Douglass in Rochester. And in Syracuse, Jermaine Logan, a minister of the AME Zion Church there in Syracuse, very outspoken for the liberation of his people. Just mention real quickly a couple of escapes. Speaking of Jermaine Logan, his slave name was Jarm Logue. He changed it when he made it to Canada. He actually came from Tennessee, and it took him several months to get to freedom. At that time, it was wilderness, and there weren't that many people to help him. It was quite a heroic journey that he made. Later on, he becomes an ordained minister. I think he was trained near Utica and takes over a church in Syracuse. One of my favorite stories, a husband and wife team, William and Ellen. That's Ellen. She was light-skinned. They dressed her up as a Southern gentleman. And her husband was her manservant. And they got on a boat, and nobody really questioned them. And eventually they ended up in Boston, where they were totally shocked that this was not a woman, it was a man, and she wasn't white, she was black. Best story, Henry Box Brown. He put himself in a wooden box. It was only a couple feet tall, so he had to kind of sit in there in a fetal position that was nailed shut, put on a train, I believe in Richmond, Virginia, and the train took him to Philadelphia, where about 2 days later, he arrived at the home of William Still, who's this man right here, and out he comes to the shock of everybody. He was sweating like a pig, but he was free as a bird. And there's all kinds of ingenious ways they used to get out of slavery. Most of them, though, were very uneventful. They went from station to station. And then the years went by, they often even rode on trains. So it wasn't underground, it was actually above ground. And the most famous person who helped slaves was Harriet Tubman, known to the people of the time as Moses. She used to sing a song, Go Down Moses, which would tell the slaves that help was there to lead them to freedom. She did most of her escapes in the eastern shore of Maryland, which is where she was born into slavery in the 1820s. This is what she looked like later, dressed up as a respectable woman. We don't know exactly how many slaves she helped escape. Probably it was around 100 she actually did herself, but maybe double that number were inspired by her and followed her routes on their own or used other people. This is a painting showing Harriet holding that rifle I talked about. She would basically tell the people, you're not going back. You come with me, you go all the way, and if you try to turn back, I'll have to shoot you. Simply because if they went back, they would be tortured and they would tell the master where everybody else was. And she bragged correctly that her train never went off the track. Not once. She had some close calls, but never once. Now, in locally speaking, many sites I should mention are not too far away from where we most live. This is in Sherwood, New York, between Ithaca and Auburn on the east side of Cayuga Lake. The Holland Stone Store, cobblestone building, which we know was involved in the Underground Railroad. Another cobblestone not far from Seneca Falls, the Ferry Farm, also involved. Another one, this one's in Geneva. This one here is in the Sexton House in Palmyra, the Pitts House in Honeoye, and way up on Lake Ontario in Pulteneyville is the cobblestone home of Horatio Throop, captain of a boat who took his passengers across the lake all the time. Now here's a map that kind of centers on this, and the dots represent stations that I'm pretty sure are reasonable locations. They're not just made up by people who want to make it believe that. You can see that some of them line up in a nice line. This is today's Route 21 from Palmyra to Pulteneyville. That is definitely an Underground Railroad trail. In the Finger Lakes itself, they would come up from Ithaca and Elmira. They would keep the lakes close enough they could see them. They could use them as compasses, and eventually they would end up at the north end of the lake. Sometimes they would be ferried across the lake to the other side. That ferry farm I showed you a minute ago is right there. They went to Seneca Falls and Waterloo, and then they went along the Seneca River to, what town is this? Lake here. I'm sorry, that's not, yeah. They went across to the Montezuma area, north of Cayuga Lake. And from there they went, I'm sorry, that's not Montezuma, that's Geneva. This is Seneca Lake. Several stations located there and one or two more outside the city. And then they had a choice. They would head kind of northwest to the Erie Canal, which is this light blue line you see there. And then up the path from station to station to Lake Ontario, or they went across the lake. And then there were other possibilities as well. They go to Rochester, they follow the canal all the way to Buffalo, they cross there. Or in Rochester, they could take a boat as well. Right below the lower falls in Kelsey's Landing, the boats would pick them up there and take them across the lake. In the Genesee Valley, there are several sites that are important. This is a site, actually this one's in Egypt. This one's in Parrington, the Talbot House. The Warrant Homestead in Brighton, near MCC, Kelsey's Landing at the park, Maplewood Hot Park, where the Rose Garden is located. You have to go down the path down to the river to get on it. This site is up in Greece, not far from the mouth of the Genesee River. So there are many different places in the Genesee Valley also involved in this. Or you could continue going westward. Rochester, Douglas's home is very near Highland Park, although it burned down after the Civil War. The Isaac Chase home in Hilton. This one is the McClue Farm, not too far from Lockport. And speaking of Lockport, the slaves are known to have hidden underneath this bridge. The canal, of course, is right there. There was a bridge that took the canal underneath it took the canal over 18 Mile Creek, and the slaves lived hid in the culvert there. In Pekin, New York, which is about 10 miles from Niagara Falls, they have the Thomas Root Home. This little statue here verifies it is a site on the Underground Railroad, as is this site in Lewiston, the Presbyterian Church, which if you walk around the other side of the building, you can see the Niagara River. And they also have a plaque in the front of their church honoring them in their role on the Freedom Trail. So here's Brooks. So we go from Honeoye, the Pitts Mansion, maybe to Lima, which is at the end of the arrow here. On from there into Henrietta, to Rochester, maybe to the Chase home out in Hilton. You go west, following the lake, to the Pekin, I'm sorry, that's Lockport, and eventually Niagara Falls, or Lewiston, where you cross the river either over a bridge or by a boat. Question, did they stay in Canaan? Actually, most did, but a lot of them did not go all the way. And this map shows the places in blue in the height of the Underground Railroad, 1850 to 1860, where the population of Black people in the North increased. Notice they're mostly in Northern and Western New York. This was the period of time when the fugitive slave law was in existence, and many slaves decided they had to go to Canada, but many returned or they never left. And more come and they settle in Western New York. We know that from the census of the time period. Or they went to Canada and decided they wanted to be closer to home for some reason and came back. And these are the people that claim that they were born in slave states and they were probably escaped slaves. Those in green make up the majority of the Black population of these counties, especially Niagara County and Chautauqua County down here in the corner. Franklin County also, but actually the large population there was because of the Dannemora prison, you know, the one that had that infamous escape a couple years ago. Those places and the Eastern New York, they were mostly people that were born here. They were descended from slaves that got their freedom back in the 1820s. Now, they weren't legally free, but they considered themselves to be free. And for the most part, most people weren't trying to get them. Every once in a while they did, though. But usually they were free. And this is just a graph showing how many people in Erie County, that is Buffalo, that came from the upper South states or the deep South states, and even a significant minority that came from Canada. Now, most of the people that were involved in helping the slaves and the escapees themselves were peaceful. They just wanted, you know, to help and get to freedom. This is Amy Post, a Quaker woman who lived in Rochester with her husband, Isaac, a good friend of Frederick Douglass, definitely involved in the abolition movement. But being a typical Quaker, she was a pacifist. But there were some examples of freed slaves that were freed violently. This is the Jerry rescue. You see this man right here in chains. He was about to be taken back to slavery in a courtroom in Syracuse, where a group of white and black Syracusans forcibly freed him and hid him for a couple of days. And eventually he made his way to Oswego and got on a boat and went to Kingston, Ontario. The black man behind him is Jermaine Logan, the minister, the black minister I talked about earlier. Another famous rescue was in Troy, New York. Charles Knoll was his name. He was about to be, he was being arrested, but the crowd there forcibly freed him, and eventually he ended up in Schenectady, and eventually he ended up in freedom somewhere. This group, by the way, was led by Harriet Tubman herself. It's an episode of her life most people are not familiar with. John Brown definitely took inspiration from these events, but he took it one step further. In those rescues, nobody was killed to my knowledge, but of course that was not the case with John Brown. Now, slavery itself does not go away until the middle of the Civil War. In 1862, Lincoln decided on issuing an Emancipation Proclamation, but only freeing the slaves that were still in states that were rebelling in the active Confederacy. That meant the states like Maryland and Kentucky it didn't apply to. It took effect on New Year's Day, 1863. And many slaves found their way to freedom at that point, and many of them joined the Union Army. The 13th Amendment, though, makes it permanent. That doesn't happen until 1865. If you've seen the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis on Lincoln, they talk about this, this rather interesting way they managed to get it freed. And slavery is abolished officially in the end of 1865, about 5 or 6 months after Lincoln himself was killed. So the question is, many people have, was my house on the Underground Railroad? Well, first of all, your house had to exist before the Civil War. The best thing to do is to go to primary sources, which I know many of you are familiar with, census records, journals that still exist, old newspapers, etc., letters, you name it. That also needs to make geographic sense. Is it in a route that makes sense connecting to other sites, such as Able Post Home, which is, oh, I went too far, excuse me. Able Post, there he is in the 18th. He definitely had a home there. We know that he was anti-slavery, but we don't know for sure if he actually was involved, but it seems likely he was, but we can only guess. Here's his home. It's on West Henrietta Road near Erie Station Road. And there's the location there inside the red circle. And to the south of that, we have the Wesleyan Seminary in Lima. There's Lima on this map. I colored it in blue because it's moderate, in my opinion, whether it actually existed as an underground station or not. But it was Wesleyan. And we know the Wesleyans hated slavery. And many of their fellow churches were actively involved. And I'm sure at least some of the students and faculty there probably were too. We just don't have anything substantial. If you know something different, please let us know. But I'm guessing it probably was. Here's what it looked like back just before the Civil War. And it's located in Lima. This is a map in 1858 of the village. It's located right there. And you can see all the roads that are there, and the road going north and south is today's 15A, East Henrietta Road eventually. So why do we honor these people? In my opinion, despite the fact this is over 150 years old, I'm always excited to learn about people who champion an unpopular cause, which had dangers. You could be arrested, you could lose all your property, and you could suffer the consequences of what you're doing. But they accepted the challenge. Many times they had to get up in the middle of the night to find shelter for a whole family of people, and that job usually fell upon the women. Slavery, in my opinion, is a national tragedy, and we need to be redeemed. And this is one way of redeeming ourselves, by honoring these people. This man right here, John Fairfield, was a captain of a ship. He was caught smuggling slaves out of Baltimore Harbor, and they branded his hand SS, which means slave stealer. To them, that was the ultimate insult, but to abolitionists, that was the ultimate compliment. And this man right here from Wyoming County, Calvin Fairbanks, actually went into Kentucky and helped people escape. But unfortunately, he himself was captured and was in prison in Kentucky up to the end of the Civil War. These are some of the last people alive in Ohio that were slaves during the Civil War. And we want to recognize these people because many times they're lost to history. And there were partnerships between whites and blacks at the same time. The man on the left is Garrett Smith, who lived near Cazenovia, very wealthy man. He worked extensively with Jermaine Logan to help shelter slaves on their way to freedom. And if they could do it then, we certainly can do it now.